Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. Tim Anaya, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I had a conversation with our colleague, PRI Fellow Kerry Jackson, on the debate over criminal justice policy in California in the aftermath of the riots in the state and nationwide. Kerry, author of Living in Fear in California, discusses the temporary changes to early release and cash bail policies during the COVID-19 crisis, controversies over police activities highlighted by the statewide riots, and potential future legislation affecting California's public safety laws. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Next Round, Kerry.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Kerry, last year you published Living in Fear in California, which explored the impact of sweeping changes to state criminal justice policy on public safety. We've seen even more dramatic changes since the COVID-19 crisis hit California. So let's talk about some of these changes. State prisons and county jails have been COVID-19 hotspots, so the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and county sheriffs throughout the state have adopted policies to reduce the inmate population to try to reduce the spread of the virus. What are some of these temporary policies they put in place?
Well, one is a zero cash bail, and this new policy, or this temporary, and put quotation marks around temporary, is there's no one has to post bail or cash bail for any misdemeanor and some low-level felonies. So you get arrested and you get released, and what do you do when you go back out there? Well, quite a few people are committing crimes again. I will say this: a stat I did see today that the daily jail population in this state, and we're talking local jails, county, city jails, is down 20,000. So it looks like they're not emptied out, but that's a significant number. But law enforcement has been complaining about this, and they've been pretty aggravated. They're having to continue to arrest the same people over and over again. Some of the things they're finding out is there are people being released essentially in their own recognizance, I guess. I'm not sure what technically it is, but they are going back and arresting them again for, here's a partial list: felony child abuse, there have been assaults, there's been attempted carjacking, there's been a robbery. So it's just to name a few. As somebody said, a get-out-of-jail-free card. One fellow was arrested 3 times in the first 12 hours after he was released. This is going into another issue. We're going into others being early release. But, it's part of the same problem. You're putting people on the streets who, in a lot of cases, just really don't belong there. And I do understand on some level what they're thinking. We need to thin out the institutions a little bit because of the coronavirus. But I think the thinking just stopped right there. I don't think it went beyond that for people who actually made the decisions and implemented the temporary policies. I think their thinking stopped very short.
Kerry, not surprisingly, what Governor Newsom and many sheriffs are doing doesn't go far enough for some advocates. One told a newspaper that their goal was to see between 10 and 15,000 early releases during the whole COVID-19 crisis. Isn't that what this is all about? A ruse to just expand early release policies that are shifting thousands of serious criminals into communities, under the guise of the COVID-19 threat?
Well, I'll go back to another stat I read that so far 3,500 state inmates have been released under an early release program. I don't want to be so cynical to say, yeah, this is just it's a ruse, as you say, but then it might very well be. I think we all have the experience of seeing these things happen, and it would be naive of us to think that might not be to just dismiss that as an underlying or real reason. But then I have to think, well, if that is the case, if this is a ruse, why? The prison population has been about 3 or 4 years now have been roughly 115,000, again, state inmate population. And this is where the Supreme Court essentially said it's got to be for you to operate under our guidelines, where you think you're not abusive, where you're not overcrowding. There needs to be some shifting around, not just because the entire population is within that, under the bar or right at it. There's still some facilities that are a little overcrowded. But I think in a way, maybe they go back and answer, is this a ruse? I have to come up and bring up the name of and the election of Chesa Bodine, who is the still new San Francisco district attorney, prosecutor who's really not going to prosecute crimes. I mean, he says you'll prosecute the serious stuff, but there's a lot of small crimes, and really, it's just not quality of life crimes that he says he's just not going to produce. And so, I think there's an organized effort, and he is one of the examples of the product of that organized effort by some very wealthy people who want to disrupt society, and by letting some crimes go unpunished. And this isn't good for civilization.
Carrie, I think the average Californian is wondering, how is it that I'm forced to shelter in place? And even in some cities, you would be arrested if you didn't stay home under the COVID-19 pandemic. And yet, they're releasing so many prisoners outside. So it's just the average Californian must think that this whole situation is completely upside down. So, the policies that have brought about, a spike in crimes throughout the state. We've heard about child abusers in Orange County, as you mentioned, being granted early release. As you said, again, a man in Southern California was arrested 3 times in one day. Share with our listeners some other examples of these troubling criminal activities that have happened throughout the state because of this swift policy change.
Well, we did have that one fellow, and I'll generously call him a fellow who was arrested 3 times in the first 12 hours. But there was one, again, another fellow. Since March 30th, he's been arrested 7 times and released. So, it's a free-for-all out there, it seems, in some cases. And of course, that's overstating the case, but how long does this have to go on? But I look at some of the other things I've seen out there. There's another one who's been released without bail 4 times, and 2 of his charges were robbery and felony domestic abuse. They're dangerous people. Another fellow, as it turns out, was released. He was apparently caught looting, vandalizing. This was before the riot, so there was another type of looting, and burglary as well. Another fellow who was locked up for auto theft and arrested for burglary with assault with a deadly weapon. And I would not want these folks really loose on my streets in my neighborhood, but yet there they are. And we'll see in the next few months and years how this is going to be, certainly in the next few months, how this might affect crime across the state. What's going to happen? It just looks to me, I'll go back to what I said before, people stop thinking. They thought up to a point, this looks good, and then after that, they shut down the thinking, the critical thinking.
Do you think that this encouraged the looting? Because if there isn't any deterrence, then certainly makes it a lot easier to loot various stores, and knowing that you're not going to go to jail, you can get off, and you're free to do it the next day.
Yeah, and there's a moral hazard there, isn't there? You give them an inch, they're going to get a foot, and give them the foot, and they're going to take a yard, and then on and on and on. If you don't say we're going to stop this and we're not going to tolerate this, then they're going to keep pushing. And we're only talking about a small portion of the population, but it's enough to cause some significant problems, even though it's, again, a tiny portion of the 39 to 40 million people.
Carrie, in your view, has the title of your great book, and for those who have not read it, we recommend, go on Amazon.com and buy a copy. It seems that the title of your book has become a reality for a lot of people in this state. So in your view, do you think people right now are living in fear in California? And do you think there will be an effort to make these temporary changes that have been put in place by executive order, in many cases, permanent through legislation?
Well, people I talk to and or hear from time to time said, yeah, they're fearful. They see crime. They feel like it's increasing, and certainly with the last few days of what's been going on in the evenings, they have good reason to feel that way, especially if you live in these urban areas and some almost suburban areas where some of these things are happening. It's not really borne out by the data, these fears, but at the same time, I went through some of this in the book. Numbers have been fudged to make it look like the crime was not increasing and make it look like it may be even going down. And this is particularly true in Los Angeles, where it became a scandal, where crimes were either not recorded like they should have been, or in a lot of cases where something was a felony was recorded as a misdemeanor. When you get this kind of situation and your eyes tell you one thing and the data tells you another, then you're going to believe your eyes most likely when in that kind of case. And then we have the rural crime and people simply out there just saying, you know what, I'm not even going to report it because nothing's going to happen. They don't have the resources. They don't have the time. It's just, why bother? I'm just going to go on and replace whatever it is was stolen. So my farm equipment, my central heating and air system was taken off the pad. They stole a lot of copper tubing, this kind of thing. So why report it? Why bother? They've learned the lesson of it. They've gotten nowhere when they have. So, this doesn't show up in the records. This doesn't show up in the data either. As for the temporary changes becoming permanent, becoming law or legislation through legislation, we'll say, I'll go back again and talk about Chesa Boudin and the efforts to disrupt society. And I would not be surprised if the people who are behind that push to install prosecutors who won't prosecute will be pushing for putting these temporary policies, making them permanent. Again, I don't think this is good for your civilization. I mean, you can go too far, and the pendulum can go too far, and you can become abusive with your law enforcement and prosecution and imprisonment. But I don't think we're at that point right now, and you can become too loose, and then you got big problems. So, given what we know and what we suspect about what's going on at higher levels with some moneyed people, I'm not going to say any names. I would be surprised if there's a hard push to make these things permanent.
Terry, during the riots, Californians on both sides of the aisle have been critical of Governor Newsom and mayors like Sacramento's Darrell Steinberg for not being very visible as communities were on fire. How do you rate the response of Governor Newsom and California's big city mayors on responding to the riots?
I wouldn't give them a good grade at all. The protests turned violent in Minneapolis May 26. So they had time. They had at least a day to prepare. And why should they? I mean, look at Los Angeles. In a sense, Los Angeles is almost riot central. You have the Watts riots, Rodney King. These things seem to come in a cycle. So you're not expecting this, or maybe again, I go back to you're not thinking things all the way through. But they could have headed things off, I think, a whole lot better by saying, yes, you're welcome to protest. We stand with you. We will protect you. There's going to be police presence there, but it's not to incarcerate you. It's not to provoke you. They were there to protect you. We'll even march with you. But they also need to say, we will not allow violence, destruction of property. We will not allow you to block the free movement of people on the streets and highways. There's going to be zero tolerance. This is our city. This is our state. We're not going to hurt each other. We're not going to destroy each other's property. And they had seen, too, they had a lesson from Minneapolis that, and I'll quote Heather McDonald writing in the City Journal. She said what happened there was a powerful sign that society would not defend its most fundamental institutions of law and order. They had this before them, and yet I think they made decisions that they showed some weakness, and you show weakness and then you get exploited, you get torn apart and run over. They could have ended this or cut it off very early, and then we wouldn't be staring at these what look like open-ended curfews at this point. We talked about when these curfews going to be over, because they keep showing up. Well, we're going to do it again tonight and into tomorrow. So how long? But I think we could have avoided that if they would have just been strong to start with.
Kerry, in response to the riots, there's been a growing call by activists in California and nationwide to, quote, defund the police. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has gone a step further in promising to cut the LAPD budget by $150 million. What would it mean for public safety if steep police department budget cuts were enacted in Los Angeles and other California communities?
Some of the talk about defunding or cutting back on funding, in some cases they're going to send money, the government is going to invest money. But government doesn't ever invest money. It's always politically allocated money. And it never works. The track record of government investment, and those two words need to be in quotation marks, is just miserable. So they're just moving money around in some of the cases, but they're promising they're going to invest in the neighborhoods that are at risk. But again, these aren't investments, and it's not going to make any difference as far as I can tell, what I'm thinking. Anyway, but efforts to defund and also to cut funding in law enforcement, they're going to be counterproductive. Who's going to suffer the most? If you're going to have a police force that's going to be restricted, it's going to be the poor neighborhoods, of course.
Kerry, last year, California passed sweeping legislation on the use of deadly force by police officers. Following the riots, several lawmakers and organizations have called for further changes to state public safety laws to address these issues of police misconduct that have been raised by the unrest. So what are some of the proposed changes to public safety laws that you expect will be debated at the Capitol this session and next?
I'm going to pull a little bit of a politician's trick here and pretend that I didn't hear all that question correctly, and then so I can talk about what I want to talk about, get my bullet points or my talking points across. And in this case, it's unions affecting police officers who should be fired, or if not fired, at least put on some kind of duty where they're not out on the street. Their temperaments are not going to get them, and other people or other people get them in trouble. They can't be abusive if they're working behind desks, that kind of thing. It doesn't matter what the policy is. If you have an officer who can't be fired for breaking that policy, who can't be held accountable, then those changes simply not going to matter. I'll give John Funn credit for writing it. He did the research and gathered some things up, writing a National Review. And he referred to a retired New York Police Department commander, Corey Peggs, who wrote a book called Once a Cop. And he said the unions, at least in New York City, outright just protect the cop. It's a blanket system of covering up for police officers. And then in Stanford Law Review, scholar Catherine Dees, she said that the rise of the police unions to political power in the 70s has succeeded in shielding members from public accountability. And this is a big problem, and I think maybe it hasn't been talked about enough or thought about enough. I mean, they can make changes in Sacramento, they can make changes in county commissions and in city halls, but as long as they're going to get the protection of unions, and I'm going to go out and say this and see if I get death threats, but unions corrupt everything they touch. And in this situation, a noble profession, a noble calling for some people in law enforcement, the unions have corrupted some of these people and have kept these people from being accountable, paying for their offenses the way they should be. I'll try to touch on the what you talk about on the proposed changes. I think, you're going to get a lot of this talk because of why else? I mean, this is what it is. So they're gonna grandstand up there. They're going to talk about how we need to make changes, but still, as long as the unions have as much power and authority that they have, that's where the reform needs to be, then nothing's really going to change as far as behavior.
Kerry, Governor Newsom has talked about legislation regarding that knee chokehold practice that outraged so many during the George Floyd incident. And other lawmakers have talked about restricting the use of rubber bullets that were very commonly used to break up the protests throughout the state. So what is exactly is being proposed, and what are your thoughts on these measures?
Well, as you say, the things you're talking about are banning that particular hold or restraint that was used on George Floyd, and then the dealing with the rubber bullets to disperse crowds or to control crowds. First, we need to establish, though, there's a difference between protesters and mobs. Protesters are peaceful. Mobs, they're violent. They damage property. They hurt people. They set things on fire. I'm speaking of the rubber bullets for now, but which is what they're going to do, is they're looking at guidelines. They're not, from what I can tell, they're not looking at this point to prohibit the use of rubber bullets, but they're looking for some guidelines, clear guidelines, to how and when they can be used. And I don't see anything necessarily wrong with this, and I think most police chiefs and sheriffs would be okay with guidelines, where they know how far that their officers can go, and they know if they don't get to that, if they don't cross that line. The other, as you spoke about, is a proposal to do away with the hold that was on George Floyd before he died. It was a knee to the neck, which cuts off blood to the head, as far as I know, from my understanding of it. And at this point, I can't imagine anyone in law enforcement would oppose banning that hold. How long would they last in their jobs if they did? If they came out publicly and said, no, we need to keep that in our arsenal of restraints? I don't think, given the temperament of the country right now, that they would be well received. In fact, the LAPD banned a chokehold almost 40 years ago. I'm pretty sure that the knee to the neck restraint is going to go the way of the chokehold that has been banned by the LAPD. I don't see a big spike in crime by banning that particular hold. But what does come to mind immediately when I think about this is if that practice had been completely banned in Minnesota, or at least in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, we wouldn't be dealing with the situation we have right now. I think that's something to think about when we consider, we think about what our thoughts are on that particular proposal.
So, Kerry, what types of changes being talked about in the aftermath of the demonstrations? What would be a good or bad thing for public safety in California? What, if any, changes do you think lawmakers should consider to address the issues brought up in recent days while also protecting public safety?
I'm actually going to go to Gavin Newsom and give him credit for something he said a couple of days ago that I thought was actually right on. And his statement was, you've got to change hearts, minds. You've got to change culture, not just laws. I think the laws that are in place handle these kinds of situations. Passing new ones, I don't see. Adding laws often makes things worse, put it that way. And the more things that you make criminal, you can trap sometimes some people into dragging it. So I think they have the tools there if they would just actually become, they would find it, make decisions faster at the levels that need to be made at. They need to be made at the governor's level, mayors, make them a little faster, be a little quicker, show some resolve, and don't be hesitant, and never give in to violence. You're just going to get more of it.
Thanks so much, Kerry.
We're glad to do it.
Special thanks to Kerry Jackson and to Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.